concepts are very simplistic, and when they're reinforced by their own home community, you get a very simplistic view of history.
In the mean streets of today's North, outside the classroom, history is a weapon in a bloody war. The walls proclaim the message, offensive to many, but it's there. They say the Provos fight for Ireland like the men of 1916. The Provos die for Ireland. Each year, the Provisionals come south to Tone's grave, according to Pearse, the holiest place in Ireland.
And you mean here?
16. Not before, but afterwards. Political things happened which ultimately brought a form of independent government to the 26 counties. And everybody seems to be so happy that this was a direct consequence of the 1916 Rising, or assume that it was. It therefore in some sense seems to make the 1916 Rising right and proper and good and in some ways almost holy. Now I would have thought that must be a great source of encouragement to the Provisional IRA, because presumably they can argue if we could only achieve some major political purpose by getting the Brits to withdraw, would not Ireland flock to us, or Republican Ireland flock to us and say what, in retrospect, what marvellous men we were and what marvellous people to pursue this campaign for so long and to then achieve this kind of success, getting rid of the Brits, as they say, out of Ireland. Now that, if that is the kind of thinking, or part of the thinking of the Provisionals, and if it is owed in part to the response of the nationalist tradition in Ireland to 1916 and the events thereafter, then it's incredibly dangerous to be uncritically accepting of what happened in 1916.
This state, such as it is, was born in violence in a rising in 1916 led by Pearse. Pearse was one of the principal motivators of a secret society, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was a clique within a clique, the Irish Volunteers. Perhaps about 20 people understood and appreciated what Pearse was setting out to do. So if we are going now to make the historical argument that violence is only justified when it has a democratic popular approval, well then in effect we are turning our backs on history and denying our own statehood.
Historian FSL Lyons says the events in the GPO 1916 have been the point of departure for all subsequent Irish history. Street names and railway stations in Dublin carry the names of its leaders, and opened in 1966 the Garden of Remembrance, a monument to those who died. Around the country, hundreds of football parks, clubs, streets take their name from 1916. Romantic Ireland was regenerated by the Rising. And the place where Pearse was buried with the others, Arbour Hill, also in Dublin. The impact of the Rising can also be seen from the men who are leading the country over 40 years later. Frank Aiken, Eamon de Valera, the President Sean T. O'Kelly, Sean Lemass, Sean McEntee. These men had no problem answering the question, where were you in 1916? And of today's government, both Liam Cosgrave's and Garrett Fitzgerald's fathers were out in 1916. Mr. Cosgrave may be his father's son, but circumstances have changed greatly.
Violence is dividing not only the communities in the north, but the people in this country from the people in the north. They're expressing more and more, and I mention this simply as a matter of record, without comment one way or the other, the idea that the unity with an area or close association with a people so deeply imbued with violence and its effects is not what they want. In this sense, violence is essentially, and indeed could be so described as accentuating the mental partition and doing what nobody in history has ever done before. It's killing here the desire for unity, which has been part of our heritage.
This has been the dominant response in the Republic to the Provisionals campaign. It hints at a staggering reversal in political attitudes, perhaps more apparent than real. But the mood here is sullen and introspective, and questioning. In 1972, Garrett Fitzgerald wrote, 1916 stands today as a psychological barrier between Protestant Ulster and the predominantly Catholic rest of Ireland. What to a majority of the Irish people has become sacred is to a Northern Protestant today an alien and even hateful tradition. This questioning is sometimes called revisionism, probably a new word in this context to some people. The truth is, it's easier to say than it is to define it. So far as we can estimate, and nobody has analysed it in any kind of detail, basically three factors seem to be at work. First of all, the normal progress of historical scholarship. For example, behind me in the National Library. By the early 60s, this was sufficiently removed from the Rising to be able to begin a reappraisal. Secondly, since 1969, the impact of the Northern conflict, coupled indeed with a growing impression of its potential for complete disaster on this island. And the third factor is the change of government from Fianna Fáil to the National Coalition at the height of that conflict in 1973. Against the backdrop of the Northern tragedy, the revisionists, among whom we may number some government ministers, academics, clerics, lay people, professional people, have taken an increasingly critical look at the way a violent past has been observed in the culture of the Irish Republic. And inevitably, their focus has been on the Rising and the War of Independence, the origins of the state.
The armed might of the UDA, as much as the Provisionals, is a sad symptom of the wasted years. North and South over 50 years to build peace, an opportunity that's gone, and largely because Unionist power denied justice to the minority. Today's argument in the Republic isn't whether 1916 created the Provisionals. That would be foolish. The IRA's main recruiting sergeants have been the Loyalists and the ghetto itself. The argument is, given Unionist misrule, has the 1916 tradition a logic in today's violence? Today, it's still almost impossible to be objective about the Rising. The volunteers fought bravely and died bravely. They gave dignity and pride to their countrymen. Pearse halted the fighting when he saw civilians being killed. Despite the damage, it was a relatively humane struggle. But the mythology doesn't tell the other side. The 300 civilians, for example, who died. 5 times more of them than of the volunteers. They were killed often in crossfire, these people, who presumably had no wish to die for Ireland or for anything. They were the innocent, unfortunate victims of the Rising. Ireland today knows their kind well. It wasn't a popular event. The crowd listening to Pearse reading the proclamation were indifferent, even hostile. Republican historian P.S. O'Hegarty said that if Ireland as a whole could have got hold of the volunteers during Easter week, they'd have torn them to pieces. But the executions changed all that. 14 of the leaders were shot, and the public mood changed. By 1917, when Republican prisoners were released, the tide was turning. The next year, 1918, brought sweeping victory in the general election. It was this election victory, 2 years after the Rising, which provides the theory of retrospective justification.
So this is the argument which can be used to justify 1916. It's an argument which Jacques Maritain, the French philosopher, has called the action of the prophetic shock minority. There's a group who anticipate. It's a doctrine going back to the French Revolution, where you have a small thinking elite group who anticipate the will of the sleepy and sluggish majority.
And are justified later in retrospect.
This is the argument. I'm just saying this is the argument put up.
Couldn't it apply today?
Well, but the people have an opportunity now to vote if they want, and they don't appear to be wanting to do so, to change the state of affairs radically.
It could happen much later, perhaps.
Well, it could, but I mean, I'm not a prophet. No historian is, but historians deal with the past, not with the future.
It's a dangerous kind of an argument, though, isn't it?
Oh, very, because in actual fact it does mean that ultimately that a small, an entirely fractional group can decide that they represent the will of the majority, which will take place in the future, and therefore on that basis they strike.
A bombing onslaught in Belfast, at least 11 dead and 120 injured.
Suddenly the centre of the city, which had been enjoying a warm and normal afternoon, was transformed into a place of billowing smoke and fire, the crash of bombs, and everywhere the sight of rescuers and firemen trying to save what they could from the wreckage. This was one of the worst disasters at the Oxford Street bus station, where the bomb, without warning, shattered the building and set it ablaze. 4 people died, 2 of them soldiers. Many were badly injured. Then began the task that rescue workers have had to go through so many times before. Among those injured here and explosions all round the city were 2 72-year-old women and a 4-year-old child. It was the absolute suddenness of the attack that seemed to stun the city. No one knew how far or how close the next explosion was going to be. A car stands in Ormeau Avenue. Troops and police have cleared the street.
For many Irish people, events like Bloody Friday and the bombing campaign have ended forever any notion that the Provisionals carry the banner of 1916.
Some people say they're the same people there, and that there's one group are the children of the other. They're not. There is no comparison at all. I'd again remind you of the proclamation in 1916, which has a sentence that those invoking the blessing of the Almighty God in our cause and asking all those who serve it not to dishonour it by cowardice, inhumanity or rapine. I think that the present Provos have dishonoured the cause of Ireland in all three ways. They've been cowardly, they've been grossly inhuman, and they have raped the morality of the Irish people, north and south, by acting in the way they have in their name, or professing to do so in their name.
And they're claimed to be the genuine heirs of the men of 1916?
It's totally untrue. They are, to my mind, they are heirs to nothing but gangsterism, hooliganism, and the lowest form of thuggery that this country has ever known, and indeed their equals to be found in many parts of the world.
1916 was not a very brutal and vicious thing. In a certain sense it wasn't, because the opportunities weren't there. It didn't last long enough, and it wasn't in the field, as it were. It wasn't mobile enough. And yet, if you look at some of the encounters that took place, even in Dublin, you find that the method of waging war was utterly brutal and vicious. The British were throwing their troops in very small numbers, but basically they were doing the same things they did in the song, that they throw the troops in, the troops are mown down. That was a vicious war. And of course, the viciousness of the executions afterwards were quite appalling. In other words, the 1916 thing to me was just the same as a civil war, any kind of war. Just the same way that the Spanish Civil War was vicious. Every war is vicious, and there's no point in comparing one with the other as if the one in the past was glorious and magnificent. It wasn't.
There is just nothing but the name, the usurpation of a name in common. I think that just totally the present movement differs from and repudiates 1916. After all, 1916 was in defence, 1916 and the movement that followed from it, because 1916 itself has been of significance in Irish history because of the movement that followed it from 1919 to 1922. And that movement essentially was a struggle in defence of Dáil Éireann, a struggle in defence of the legitimate parliament of the Irish people. And it seems to me very significant that the army which then fought was the army of a parliament, of a government, that it was a constitutional army, and in that sense a properly democratic army, not an army that set itself up without any sort of constitutional electoral backing.
An objective study of the War of Independence shows that, like all wars, it was a fairly brutal and bloody business, and that you can't say that it was fought in a completely altruistic manner, and the present war is not. But on the more general question of justification, I believe the struggle in the six counties at the moment is basically the same struggle, caused by the similar reasons, that the War of Independence arose when people of Ireland were looking for independence. They tried to achieve it through constitutional means. They were frustrated in that and used force. In the north, people have, the minority have been subjected for 50 years to a regime of gerrymandering sectarianism, which has degraded and oppressed them. They tried to change it by peaceful means. They were frustrated in that, and they've turned to force.
Dr. Daly, reading your book, you do seem to be deeply troubled by the legacy of 1916. What is your attitude to that whole tradition?
I would have thought I was concerned with the myth, the mythology, the glamorization of 1916. It's being taken out of context, isolated from the whole constitutional movement which had gone before us and which helped create the Irish state. But let's not forget, the legacy of 1916 is Dáil Éireann.
Dr. Daly's concern is with what he sees as the glorification of violence in the Republic.
The orators, the rhetoricians, didn't realize that their words and their songs could be lethal. Now, it was understandable for the first generation, I think, whose whole life had been staked on their revolution, to glamorize this. It's very human to do this. But the great bulk of the Irish people repudiated this. For the great bulk of the Irish people, the songs were sentiment, they were rhetoric. They were not meant to be taken seriously. But I think that now, when we realize that words can kill, that songs can bomb, I think we've got to be very careful.
Most of us have sat in pubs like this in the past. Isn't it strange that so many are uneasy about it today?
When the English on ill will run before us, and if there be a need, then like this will sing us me, with the lesson to a Stephen being chorus. By the left! Quick! March!
In assessing the legacy of 1916, Pearse, perhaps unfairly to others, has been the centre of attention. For long he's been regarded as a virtual saint in the Republic. Carty's history described him as one of the noblest characters in Irish history. Kind to his mother, deeply religious, gentle, gave his life for Ireland. Pearse seemed the epitome of virtue. The Department of Education urged teachers for years to imbue their pupils with the ideals and aspirations of such men as Thomas Davis and Patrick Pearse. Then in 1972, Studies magazine published a blistering attack on Pearse by a Jesuit, Frank Shaw. The article was submitted in 1966, but was held out. The fact it was published in 1972 indicated the changing mood. Shaw saw Pearse's legacy as a violent, even divisive one. He found his writings disturbing. For example, Pearse wrote in 1915, "We must not faint at the sight of blood. Winning through it, we, or those of us who survive, will come to great joy." And another quote that disturbed Shaw, "We may make mistakes in the beginning and shoot the wrong people, but bloodshed is a cleansing and a sanctifying thing, and a nation which regards it as the final horror has lost its manhood." Then in 1915, Pearse wrote about the violence of the First World War. "It is good for the world that such things should be done. The old heart of the earth needed to be warmed with the red wine of the battlefields." Language like this and Pearse's contradictory nature are analysed in Ruth Dudley Edwards' new biography of the 1916 leader.
Violence, remember, especially with the outbreak of the war in 1914, became a respectable thing to talk about. British propaganda was all about blood and what was going to be done to the Germans. The Irish rhetoric was much the same, and Pearse became hooked on the rhetoric of violence. His rhetoric was rather idiosyncratic, because he had read so much of the Irish sagas, because he always saw his particular kind of violence in terms of going out with his sword and confronting the British nation or whatever. He saw violence as something symbolic. But it was a peculiarly personal kind of violence he was talking about, purely a symbolic one. He was in no way a cruel man. He was in fact a man who was incapable of cutting a loaf of bread. He was a man who couldn't bear cruelty in any form. What he wrote on the page and what he himself was were often two very different things.
On the use made of the 1916 tradition, the author says, "Children in a free Ireland were nurtured on the writings and deeds of the men of 1916, and condemned by their own government when, as adults, they put into action the logic of force they absorbed from them." Meanwhile, in a recent edition of Administration magazine, an eminent member of the Irish Bar has been contributing to the debate about the Rising.
Well, of course it was a noble and inspiring occasion, I suppose, for all of us. In many ways, in retrospect, one might say that we might have gone further more easily if it hadn't taken place.
Donald Barrington's criticism of the 1916 tradition centres largely on the issue of the North.
Primarily in relation to the North, yes. I think the 1916 leaders saw the Irish problem simply as a struggle between Irish nationalism and British imperialism. The British Empire then, of course, ruled an enormous section of the globe, and they regarded themselves as a tiny country pitted against a giant. They paid very little regard to the northern problem. They thought it would kind of solve itself. And indeed, I think Pearse said on one occasion that he much preferred to contemplate an orange man with a gun than a nationalist without a gun. But in fact, we today have to contemplate the Orange Man with a gun, and a number of nationalists with guns also. And our position is not a happy one.
You say in your book that he was an innocent on the north.
Yes, Pearse was an innocent in many areas. He had an ambivalent view on the north. Many of his friends came from Ulster. Many of the people who had helped him to keep St. Enda's going in the face of mighty odds had been from Ulster. And he had a conviction that when Ireland was free, or when freedom loomed, that the North would respond, that they would see the virtues of the great Gaelic civilization which would open up, that the society which would be created would be so marvellous that of course the Northerners would respond to it. And that is as far as he went. He didn't really want to be bothered with intractable political problems like that. He always believed that one made the leap and everyone followed. He was, in his lifetime, usually very, very disappointed.
Is there anything in Pearse's writings, would you say, that had he known that the Northerners would react as they have done to the foundation of the state, that he would have been prepared to coerce them?
I don't think it was in character with the man. He believed in methods of persuasion. He didn't believe in coercion. I mean, it might seem that starting a revolution suggested that he was a coercive type, but he believed that by standing up to the British Army and dying nobly, that he would make the Irish people flock to him. I think he would have been sadly bewildered that the Northerners didn't join in a free Ireland, but I don't think he would have ever thought in terms of coercion.
But there is ammunition around for those who seek it. James Connolly wrote in 1914, "To partition, Labour in Ulster should give its bitterest opposition. Against it, Labour in Ulster should fight, even to the death if necessary, even as our fathers fought before us." Partition it was to be. The new state from the start was dominated by the tradition of the Rising, and haunted by it. It had to live with the uncomfortable fact that it manifestly was not the 32-county republic proclaimed by Pearse, but a mere 26 counties. Its legitimacy was under constant armed threat from the IRA. Even Fianna Fáil had its doubts about the 26 counties. A slightly constitutional party, the Masses' famous phrase went. But the party chose constitutional methods, not war. It came into the state and did more than any other group to make it stable and viable under the leadership of Eamon de Valera. But the challenge of the IRA was always there and seemed to be there.
De Valera left Sinn Féin in the 1920s. He said, and I think in Dáil Éireann, 1929, that both those who had come with him and those he had left could claim to be the legitimate descendants or heirs of 1916 and of the unity that was Sinn Féin up to the Civil War. There is no doubt that the mainstream of the position of 1916 and of the War of Independence as the basis of our state has, as a consequence, that there is unfinished business about. And it's how we go on about this unfinished business. Do we say now with a new consensus, if there is such a thing?
So the government is ambiguous about 1916. Many people are distressed and resentful at the government's attitude. They see ministers blowing cold on the memory of the Rising as if they were somehow ashamed of it. But the government's problem is that it's uncomfortably aware that 1916 was intended to hand on to the future, perhaps to today, a tradition of each generation rising to strike against British rule in Ireland, and not necessarily with a mandate. Well, the difficulty that this poses today scarcely needs emphasizing. The fact is that the government is caught on a hook over 1916, which it wants to get off, but not to the extent of disowning the Rising, which it probably doesn't want to, and probably wouldn't survive if it did. But it amounts to an unusual position.
We taught our young people hatred of England. We taught them that the 6 counties were rightfully ours. That is, that they should be ruled by Catholics. We taught them that violence was the path to freedom. We taught them all that. And then we locked them up when they joined the IRA.
almost ready to go there, and Rodney.
Well, what about at this stage, at 25 to 5, Michael Gallagher, have you got an overall total for us yet, something that you think is likely to... we've heard from tallies from everywhere, we've got very complete tallies from everywhere, so what are you coming up with?
I have an overall total, but though, of course, it's no guarantee that it's anything like reliable. We revise it as the afternoon goes on, but at this stage, I'd be looking at around 74 seats for Fianna Fáil, around 55 for Fine Gael. Labour could be back in the
ready for Dublin North East.
And the total poll is 37,669. There were 368 invalid votes, and the total valid poll is 37,301, with a quota of 7,461, 7,461. The total votes of the candidates are as follows. Brady Martin, 5,018, 5018. Rohan Tommy, 3,447, 3447.
Labour.
Burns John, 155, 155. Cooney Donna, 1,332, 1332.
Green Party.
Cosgrave Michael Joe, 4,173, 4173.
Fine Gael.
Creevy Anthony, 1,381, 1381.
DL.
Fitzgerald Liam Joseph, 4,394, 4394.
Fianna Fáil.
Foley Mairead, 2911, 2,911.
PD.
Fraser Lar, 3939. Kenny Dr. Sean, 2,986, 2986.
Labour.
Maher Joan, 2,877, 2877. O'Toole Larry, 2,212.
Sinn Féin.
2212. Poole Owen, 641, 641.
Independent.
Woods Michael, 5,735, 5735.
Fianna Fáil.
No candidate has reached the quota on this count, and I am therefore eliminating the three lowest candidates, Lar Fraser, John Burns, and Owen Poole, and we will proceed to the second count to distribute their votes.
Right.
Thank you very much.
There we leave Dublin North East, and we're going now to Dublin South West, which will be of interest, I think, to Chris Flood, who is here with us. Dublin South West in Tala.
Total poll, 42,292, 42,292. Spoiled votes, 440, 440. That leaves the total valid poll at 41,852, 41,852. The quota is 6,976, 6,976. And this is how the candidates polled. Sean Crowe, 3,725, 3,725.
Sinn Féin.
Dennis Dowling, 71, 71. Monique Federshell, 1,315, 1315.
Green Party.
Chris Flood, 5,195, 5195.
Fianna Fáil.
Mary Harney, 4,713, 4713.
PD.
Brian Hayes, 6,487, 6487. Mary Kinsella, 509, 509.
Independent.
Conor Lenihan, 4,436, 4436.
Fianna Fáil.
Colin McGrath, 2,898, 2898.
Fianna Fáil.
Dermot Mara, 242, 242. Mick Murphy, 2,026, 2026.
Socialist Party.
Pat Rabbit, 5,094, 5094.
DL.
Harry Richards, 76, 76. Colin Tyndall, 995,
PD.
995. Eamon Walsh, 4,070. 4070.
Labour Party.
No candidate has reached the quota on the first count.
And that's the
now we proceed,
first
with the second count, which involves the elimination of
first
four
count from
candidates.
Dublin Southwest, and interestingly, it's a count we're in a position to compare with our tallies, and they were pretty accurate all the way. Chris Flood, you're a candidate. You're in that constituency for Fianna Fáil. How do you read it there now?
Well, as you said, the tallies were quite accurate there. I was just a little bit concerned at the early part of the tallying that it might have gone a little astray. All the major parties there worked together on the tallies and exchanged figures, but they seem to be fairly accurate. So there's very interesting figures obviously here. First of all, obviously, not to continue to restate it, but obviously the Labour vote has completely collapsed from the last election, where with Mervyn Taylor, who retired this time, but himself and Eamon Walsh got 2 seats in the last election. That Labour vote is now gone. And it would appear that, in fact, for the last seat, that Eamon Walsh will be fighting it out possibly with our Conor Lennon for the last seat. So Senator Brian Hayes for Fine Gael has done extremely well there. He was a very fine candidate and did work very hard in the area for quite some time. So obviously he's had his rewards there. He comes in, of course, and to essentially rebuild the Fine Gael organisation, because it was previously represented in that constituency by first Michael Leary and laterally then I think attempted by Michael Keating, neither of whom really made a success of it, but Brian certainly has, and I take this opportunity to congratulate him on his success. Looking at Mary Harney's vote at 4,713, well, it's hard to see where she's going to get the rest of her vote from, because as you can see, her running mate Colm Tyndall polled poorly, less than 1,000, and we did feel at the time on the Fianna Fáil side that it was a mistake to run a second candidate, and we really couldn't understand the reason why it happened, but obviously it hasn't paid off. The other interesting vote that we would refer to obviously is the Sinn Féin vote, where Sean Crowe has done exceptionally well. If I remember the last time, the same candidate would have polled around 900 first preferences, and he's increased it to this type
right,
of
that
figure
seems
this
to
time.
be an emerging pattern in a lot of constituencies. We want to talk more about this and many other constituencies, but right now we're going to take a very short break. Welcome back. You're listening to Election 97 results with Sean O'Rourke and Rodney Rice, and we're going to talk very soon to Ministers Ivan Yates and Brendan Howlin, who have been patiently waiting in Wexford to talk to us. But before we do, Finbar Fitzpatrick of Fine Gael, you wanted to make a point about that count we've just had in Dublin Southwest.
Yes, I think in addition to Mary Harney being hard pressed, one should remember that the gap between Walsh of Labour and Crowe of Sinn Féin is less than 300 votes. And it would be interesting to see how the Socialist Party candidate with 2,000 votes, where his transfers will go, and it is conceivable that Crowe might overtake Walsh at that stage. Whether he will hold it or not is another thing. But I think that's an element to that count, I think, that nobody had been expecting. So the last 2 seats there could be exceedingly interesting.
Right, and James Wren of the Labour Party, you've been looking there?
Yes, although I think Walsh would probably benefit much more than Crowe, let's say, from Green Party votes, right? But it will be tight, there's no doubt about that.
Right, there's just almost 1,300, over 1,300 Green Party votes. Right, to Wexford now. We haven't heard from there for quite some time. Ministers Ivan Yates and Brendan Howlin are both there. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Right, I suppose Ivan Yates, first to you, given it looks like from the tally that you've topped the poll with over 10,000 votes. Is that how it's going to emerge?
Yes, we expect to have a first count here within about half an hour. Both Brendan and I have exceeded the quota on the first count, and it very much looks like the Rainbow will hold their 3 seats here, and it will be 2-2-1.
Right, and before we go any further, I'm told, and they're coming at us thick and fast, we have a first count from Westmeath.
Valid poll. 32,787. 32787. The quota is 8,197. 8197. The following are the first preferences of the candidates. Abbott H. Fianna Fáil, 4,706. 4706. Cooney B. Non-Party, 175. 175. Glynn Fianna Fáil, 3,005. 3005. McGrath Fine Gael 5,218, 5218. Murray National Party 1,118, 1118. O'Rourke Fianna Fáil 7,262, 7262. Penrose the Labour Party 8,037, 8037. Whelan Fine Gael 3,266, 3266. As no candidate has reached the quota on the first count, the second count will be the exclusion of Benny Cooney's 175 votes and Danny Murray's 1,118 votes, and the distribution of their votes.
Right, there we leave the count from Westmeath. The first count there, a great result, I think, for Willie Penrose, and maybe that's a point that Brendan Howland and Wexford you might like to comment on, given that the wind has been blowing into your faces, as it were.
Last week, and I said Willie Penrose was going to be written off by the pundits, and he was as safe as a house because he's worked so hard. He really deserves it. I've been all over Westmeath with Willie Penrose, and he's as known in every parish, in every section and community right across Westmeath, so it's well deserved. I'm delighted for him.
Right, and again, your own vote, congratulations on that. It's as near as makes no difference, I suppose, to 10,999, 9,700.
I think that's a slight exaggeration. It'll be 9,500 and a bit.
Right, that was just on the tally, but still, it's close enough. How are you and Ivan Yates reading the subsequent seats? Sorry, I'm told we've got to count in loud.
Shaky. Boy vote 603. Votol Delishana, the Cuig Mila is a huck. 45, that's a valid poll of 45,008. On quota Taukon, Ni Mila is a do, the quota 9,002. Lian Zeachon Lalenu Kahar, the number of seats to be filled is 4. Thorough on Cade Corov, the result of the first count. Ahern Dermot. Jet Mila, Cade Noka Sado, 10,192. Bell Michael
Labour.
Keramila Shockade is a Fiha Cuig, 4,725. Brennan Terry.
Fine Gael.
3 Mila Shockade Fihis a 3, 3,723. Doyle
Independent.
Brian. Kerricade Shocktos a Cuig, 475. Godfrey Frank
Independent.
Mila Sitruka Shocked, 1,037. Grehan Mary
PD.
Gavila 3 Cade Nokas a Cuig, 2,395. Hanratty Owen.
Sinn Féin.
Gavila Shockade Shaska, 2,760. Healy Maeve.
Sinn Féin.
Upgade Noka Zahain, 891. Kirk Seamus.
Fianna Fáil.
Cuig Mila Shakade Shaska is a shot, 5,667. McCann Neil.
Greens.
Mila Kerricade is a 3, 1,403. McGahan Brendan.
Fine Gael.
Keramila 3 Cade Dahad is a Shay, 4,346. O'Brien Campbell Maria.
Fianna Fáil.
Gavila Cade is a Kegahin, 2,151. O'Dowd Fergus.
Fine Gael.
Keramila Kerricade Octos a Shay, 4,486. Salter Michael.
Independent.
Shakade Octos a Shay, 686. Taff Desi.
Independent.
Shoctos a Hen, 71. Now, Osrode Ganyaki Ahern Harankota Taokon Program Gwilshe Tutta. As Ahern has exceeded the quota, I deem him elected.
Right. And Dermot Ahern there clearly topping the poll and being elected on the first count for Fianna Fáil. That count we took simultaneously with television there. I think we'll just go back to Wexford briefly, because I think we have been interrupted, I won't say rudely, but by news breaking as we speak. Brandon Howland, it looks like Michael Bell, now we'll have an analysis from our guest in studio here, but he is in some bother, the suggestion is there.
Well, his first preference vote is clearly down. Michael is chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party and is an extremely hard-working deputy. Focuses on the southern end of Louth, very strong in Drogheda. I'm surprised that his vote has slipped. I haven't the full figures in front of me to know what his ultimate prospects are.
Right, and I was asking you then a few moments ago as to how you and Ivan Yates were calling the subsequent seats being filled. The Fianna Fáil candidates, I think John Brown is close enough to 9,000, and then Hugh Byrne is just over 7, and then Mr. Aspel a fair bit behind, maybe 1,000 votes behind. And Ivan Yates, how do you read the Fine Gael seats?
I think that myself and Brendan will be elected on the first count. I think that Michael Darcy is about 1,500 votes ahead of Avril Doyle, and she'll find it difficult to catch that up. And I think that there'll be no change on the Fianna Fáil side, that Brown and Byrne will probably be the two just shading it ahead of Aspel.
Right, and
I wouldn't agree.
And we'll be going to get some other.
Disagree with that.
Sorry, Brendan Holland, you were saying
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Right. So, despite a high profile and being in government as a junior minister, it looks like Avril Doyle, that musical chairs is going to continue there in Wexford.
Well, Avril's difficulty is that she's in the same area as myself and Dennis Aspel, whereas Michael Darcy has the Gorey district to himself, and he's run a very strong campaign for a representative for North Wexford.
Right. Well, again, congratulations to you both, ministers, and also thanks for bearing with us. Perhaps we'll have a chance to have a more leisurely conversation later in the evening, but for the moment we'll leave it there. Thank you indeed, and thanks for that. Now, I'm told that we have Peter Leonard standing by in Ennis at the concert there with the details of the result of the first count from Clare. Peter.
Good afternoon to you, Sean, from Clare. Yeah, the first count has just been announced, and the results are Aston 499.
Okay, will you give us the quota there, Peter, please, before we go any further? That's in Clare.
Yeah, the quota is 9,378.
Right.
The total valid poll was 46,889. Spoil votes accounted for 477. So the total poll was 47,366. So going through the candidates, Aston Christian Solidarity Party 499.
499, yeah.
Donald Carey, Junior Minister, 7,781.
7,781. Donald Carey Fine Gael, yes.
Brendan Daly, 7,420.
7,420 for Daly of Fianna Fáil.
Sheila De Valera, 8,025.
8,025 for Sheila De Valera of Fianna Fáil.
Tony Killeen, 8,169.
8,169 for Killeen of Fianna Fáil.
Mikowski Bridget Independent, 944.
944 for Mikowski.
Mary Mannion Progressive Democrat, 3,250.
3,250 for Mary Mannion of the PDs.
McInerney Independent, 234.
234 McInerney.
Helen Meany, the Green Party, 1,682.
Sorry, can I have that one again?
1,682.
All right, for Meany of the Green Party, yes.
O'Connor of the 876.
Right, that's O'Connor of the National Party, Rita O'Connor.
Madeleine Taylor Quinn, Senator, Fine Gael, 6,325.
6,325, Taylor Quinn of Fine Gael.
And Breeding Twist, 1,684.
Right, 1,684 for Breeding Twist. Quite a drop on the, I think, 5,000 or so votes that Musaji Bamji got for Labour there on the first count in 92. So how are people interpreting those figures? Clearly, Killeen, De Valera and Daly, they're fairly well bunched there, with Killeen and De Valera that little bit ahead.
Yeah, the feeling here locally is I think Fianna Fáil are very confident that they will take 3 seats. Tony Killeen has topped the poll, and Sheila De Valera, both of them have polled very well. They're the outgoing TDs. Brendan Daly has performed very well and is in 4th place behind Donald Carey. So the question is now, can Daly hold off the challenge from Madeleine Taylor-Quinn? Madeleine is likely to pick up votes from Rainbow Partners, Breeding Twist. She has 1,600 votes to distribute, so that could go to Madeleine. But down the line, Mary Mannion of the PDs, who got just over 3,000 votes, is likely to transfer to Fianna Fáil. So Fianna Fáil are confident that they'll be able to keep Madeleine Taylor-Quinn out and take 3 seats to 1 for Fine Gael.
Right, we're going there to leave the situation in Clare, and we're going to take a commercial break.